Welcome back to The Last Climb. Today we're looking at a family expedition on Mount Everest, a father returning to the summit 20 years later, this time with his wife and 2 children. Before reaching the upper slopes, they faced a decision about a dangerous section of the route one experienced climbers couldn't agree on. Knowing what happened, the moments leading up to it become even more haunting. It was May 14th, 2017. Everest Base Camp sat beneath a clear night sky in Nepal's Khumbu Valley, with temperatures dropping below freezing. 4 days later, the same team would begin a traverse on the Lhotse face that would end in one of Everest's deadliest hazards. Adrian Kleinhaus was 54 years old and the founder of a successful architectural firm in Denver, Colorado. Friends, colleagues, and people who worked with Adrian described him as organized, disciplined, and methodical in both his professional and outdoor pursuits. Outside of work, he stayed active with trail running, skiing, and mountain trips whenever he could. And for Adrian, Everest wasn't unfamiliar territory. He had already stood on the summit once before, back in 1997, when he was just 34 years old. Daniela Kleinhaus, 51, was a licensed occupational therapist with a private practice in the Denver area. An experienced hiker and climber, she had completed numerous high-altitude routes and winter ascents before preparing for Everest. Though less experienced than Adrian, she trained for months and built confidence through physical preparation and previous altitude exposure. Adela Kleinhaus, 22, had recently graduated from the University of Colorado Boulder with a degree in environmental science. She shared her father's passion for the outdoors, having climbed Colorado's 14,000-foot peaks with him throughout her teenage years. She also managed the expedition blog, documenting the family's journey for those following from home. Adiel Kleinhaus was 18 years old and had delayed college to join the expedition. A varsity lacrosse player and cross-country runner, he arrived in Nepal as a highly conditioned athlete. He had trained on Colorado's 14,000-foot peaks and completed mountaineering courses focused on glacier travel, rope systems, and high-altitude safety. Though the least experienced climber in the family, he arrived with years of athletic training and preparation for high-altitude climbing. 18 years old, he put college on hold for this. That keeps landing on me different every time I read it. To understand what the morning of May 14th meant, it is necessary to understand the 18 months that preceded it and the 20 years before that. In May 1997, Adrian Kleinhaus had stood on the summit of Mount Everest as part of a guided expedition on the South Col route. The climb was real, difficult, and dangerous. He crossed the Khumbu Icefall, made his way through the western CWM, climbed the Lhotse face, spent a night at the South Col, and finally reached the summit under unusually clear conditions. That experience became the defining achievement of his life. The 1,997 Everest climb remained an important part of Adrian's public identity. Photos from the expedition and references to the achievement appeared in materials connected to his professional life, reflecting how significant the climb had become to him. Not because it was his only accomplishment, but because Everest had become the one thing everything else was compared to. It was the achievement he measured everything against. My mind goes straight to those office photos, the summit picture framed behind the desk, the kind of thing that eventually becomes inseparable from who you are. The idea of returning to Everest with his family didn't happen overnight. It developed slowly, over many years, before finally taking shape in late 2015, when Adela started showing real interest in high-altitude climbing. Adrian began planning almost immediately. The family landed at Tenzing Hillary Airport in Lukla on April 3rd, 2017. Located at 9,334 feet in eastern Nepal, Lukla serves as the main gateway for Everest expeditions. From there, climbers make a multi-day trek to base camp, gaining roughly 8,000 feet of elevation over about 40 miles. The Kleinhaus family completed the approach without difficulty and acclimatized well to the early altitude. During the approach to base camp, members of the expedition recalled that Adrian often compared the landscape with what he remembered from his 1997 Everest climb, pointing out places where the mountain had changed over the previous 2 decades. Lakpa pointed out that several features Adrian remembered had changed significantly because of years of glacial movement. It was a small moment, and the group kept moving. But it showed something important. Adrian's memories were tied to the Everest he climbed in 1997. not necessarily the mountain that stood in front of him in 2017. I keep coming back to that correction from Lapka. Quiet, no confrontation, just a man who has watched the mountain change, doing his job. Everest is always changing. Sometimes the changes are small, almost impossible to notice. Other times, they completely reshape the mountain. The difference might not be obvious when looking at the entire landscape, but it showed up in moments like this: a landmark that was gone, a route that had shifted, a place that felt familiar but wasn't quite the same anymore. The family arrived at base camp on April 9th. The camp was a dense arrangement of tents on the moraine glacier at the foot of the Khumbu icefall, home to dozens of expedition teams from around the world. Colored shelters stretched across the rocky ice in a settlement that functioned like a temporary field station. Gear was organized. Adiel photographed everything. Adela began writing. Lakpa conducted the team's first formal briefing, covering the 2017 route in detail. The South Col route had changed since Adrian's 1997 climb. Glacial movement had altered parts of the Khumbu icefall, while conditions on the Lhotse face had led guides to adjust sections of the standard route. Using route photographs and expedition maps, Lakpa showed how the current season's fixed lines differed from those used 2 decades earlier. Such changes were routine on Everest, where routes are regularly adapted to shifting terrain. Adrian listened closely during the briefing. He understood the overall route, why acclimatization rotations mattered, and what climbing at extreme altitude would demand. Expedition discussions recorded during the preparation period showed that Adrian repeatedly compared the updated route with the one he had climbed 20 years earlier. There is no indication that Adrian rejected the information being presented. Instead, his questions often focused on comparing the current route with the mountain he had climbed 20 years earlier. He was comparing what he was hearing with what he had seen 20 years earlier, putting his own memories alongside Lakpa's current understanding of the mountain. The briefing highlighted a difference in perspective. Lakpa was describing the conditions of Everest as they existed in 2017, while Adrian was drawing from an earlier experience on a mountain that had changed considerably since 1997. The first 2 acclimatization rotations, between April 11th and April 28th, took the family from base camp through the Khumbu icefall to Camp 1 at 19,900 feet and Camp 2 at 21,300 feet. The icefall, a shifting maze of crevasses, ice towers, and ladder crossings maintained by the icefall doctors, is one of the most hazardous sections of the South Col route. The family crossed it 4 times without incident, and what initially felt intimidating gradually became familiar. Above the icefall, the route entered the western CWM, a broad glacial valley enclosed by Everest, Lhotse, and Nuptse. Adela and Adiel experienced mild altitude headaches above 20,000 feet that responded to hydration and ibuprofen, while Daniela's pace slowed at higher elevations, but she remained capable of continuing the rotations. Adrian performed strongly throughout both rotations and often compared his recovery to what he remembered from 1997. During the second rotation, the team passed beneath a large serac above the traverse between Camp 2 and Camp 3 on the Lhotse face. Photographs taken during the acclimatization rotations showed changes around the lower section of the formation, which were later discussed among team members. The crack drew little attention at the time, as such features are common on Everest and offered no clear indication of instability. I get why nobody stopped the clock on it. A visible fracture on Everest isn't a rare thing, and treating everyone like a crisis would shut down the whole mountain. The detail would later become important. Seracs constantly develop internal fractures as glaciers move, and their outward appearance often reveals little about their true condition. A formation can remain unchanged for weeks and then fail without warning, making serac collapse one of the mountain's most unpredictable hazards. The traverse beneath the serac offered little room for escape. Fixed ropes confined climbers to a narrow path across a steep slope with no safe shelf or open margin beside the route. In the event of a major collapse, there would be few practical options once a climber was committed to the crossing. The team spent May 1st through May 12th at base camp resting and monitoring weather forecasts. Conditions for the following week appeared favorable, with clear skies, light winds, and a stable weather window, attracting multiple summit teams. The climb above Camp 2 would serve both as a final acclimatization effort and as the beginning of their summit push. During the final pre-rotation briefing on May 12th, Lakpa addressed the Serac directly. Sherpas working above Camp 2 had reported intermittent cracking from the formation, and photographs suggested that a visible fracture had widened since the team's previous rotation. While some guides considered the changes a normal part of seasonal glacier movement, others believed the formation deserved closer attention. The reports concerning the Sherpas were circulating among several expeditions at base camp. Opinions differed. Some guides planned to continue using the standard route unless conditions visibly deteriorated, while others were considering minor adjustments to reduce exposure beneath the formation. No consensus emerged. As was often the case on Everest, teams reviewed the same information and reached different conclusions. During route discussions, Lakpa raised concerns about the standard traverse and proposed an alternate line that would keep the team farther from the Sherpas. The alternate route would take several more hours and involve steeper climbing, but it would keep the team farther from the ice formation. Lakpa personally preferred the safer option, though he knew some teams were still planning to take the standard route. Lapka is standing in front of this family and telling them there's a better path, and to me that moment carries a weight that the word briefing doesn't fully capture. Someone left a comment on a previous Everest video that stayed with me. They wondered why Sherpas don't always get the final decision when they sense danger. The question came back here as Lapka urged Adrian to consider another route, but this wasn't just Lapka's choice to make. It was a decision shaped by the guide, the climber, and the trust between them. Adrian listened carefully and asked how the Sherpas compared to the one he remembered from 1997. Lakpa explained that this formation had grown and shifted, putting it more directly above the traverse than it had been during Adrian's earlier climb. After looking over photographs, Adrian agreed that the fracture looked larger, but he still wondered if the changes were enough to completely avoid the standard route. He wanted to see the conditions from Camp 2 and compare what he observed with the reports coming from higher up the mountain. He wasn't ignoring the warning or simply taking unnecessary risks. The team's route discussions showed that the warning was taken seriously. Adrian asked about the condition of the Sherpas, reviewed the available information, and weighed the additional difficulty of the alternate route. But the problem was that a Sherpas's stability couldn't really be judged just by looking at it. Adrian had climbed Everest before, but he had never dealt with this exact formation in its current condition. The mountain had changed, and his experience from 20 years earlier couldn't fully predict what was waiting ahead. As the only member of the family with previous Everest summit experience, Adrian's judgment carried significant weight during discussions about the route and conditions. Every one of them, Daniela, Adela, Adiel, looking into the same direction for the answer. That image doesn't leave me. The team moved through the Khumbu Icefall to Camp 1 and then Camp 2 at 21,300 feet. During the ascent, one support Sherpa twisted an ankle on a ladder crossing and returned to base camp. A minor setback that did not alter the plan. The team rested at Camp 2 for roughly 36 hours. Conditions remained favorable, and the Sherpas was clearly visible above the traverse. In the morning light, it appeared massive, solid, and unchanged. Adela continued updating the expedition blog from camp, focusing on the scenery, progress of the climb, and experiences of the team. Her post did not mention the Sherpas as a major concern before the accident. She's 22, writing about the landscape for people back home, and I find myself thinking about what those readers were reading while this was happening. On the evening of May 17th, Lakpa received a radio report from a Sherpa team descending from Camp 3. They had heard intermittent cracking sounds near the upper sections of the route and noticed changes around the fracture line above the traverse. The observations raised concern, but their meaning was unclear. On Everest, shifting ice, cracking sounds, and visible fractures are common features of glacial terrain, and experienced climbers often have to distinguish between normal movement and signs of serious instability. The report added uncertainty rather than providing a clear warning. Lakpa shared the information with Adrian at Camp 2 and again recommended taking the alternate route. Adrian reviewed the reports alongside the conditions visible from Camp 2. The temperatures had stayed well below freezing overnight. The face looked unchanged, and other teams were still continuing along the standard route. Based on Lakpa's account of their discussion, Adrian acknowledged the concerns, but believed the available information did not clearly indicate that the standard route had become unusable. The alternate path was the more cautious choice, but it also meant more climbing time and steeper terrain. After talking it over with Lakpa, Adrian believed the standard traverse was still within the level of risk climbers accepted on Everest. Lakpa had the responsibility to make safety recommendations and could advise the team not to continue if he believed the risks had become unacceptable. The Serac showed signs of change, but there was no visible collapse, active ice fall, or official route closure. Several experienced teams continued using the standard traverse, while others chose alternatives. Lakpa later explained that he considered the alternate route the safer option, but that conditions had not provided a clear indication that the standard route was impossible to use. After explaining the risks again, he agreed to continue while monitoring the conditions closely. Lakpa recorded the team's route discussions, including the concerns raised about the Serac and the options that had been considered. Like many expedition leaders on Everest, he maintained detailed notes of conditions, route decisions, and safety briefings throughout the climb. I think it's easy to forget how much planning happens behind the scenes on a mountain like this, even before anyone takes a step upward. Those records later helped investigators reconstruct what information had been available to the team before the accident. The team left Camp 2 before dawn on May 18th. Conditions were cold, clear, and calm as headlamps traced narrow paths across the Lhotse face. Adrian moved at the front of the family group, with Lakpa close behind, while two support Sherpas positioned themselves at the front and rear of the climbing line. The lower Lhotse face is steep, hard ice that demands steady concentration. Climbers move in single file along fixed ropes, repeating the same sequence for hours. Unclip, reclip, step upward, and continue. The family had already spent weeks acclimatizing and had climbed portions of the face during earlier rotations. By this stage, the routine felt practiced. One of the support Sherpas later recalled that the team appeared comfortable and in good spirits as they gained elevation that morning. As dawn broke, sunlight started reaching the upper Lhotse face, while much of the route below was still covered in shadow. The top sections of the Serac cluster caught the first light, standing out against the darker ice below. From where the team was positioned, the changes were visible, but still far away. The conditions remained cold and calm. A few climbers from other expeditions could be seen higher up the face, while a small group was making its way down toward Camp 2. It wasn't as busy as it would be during the main summit push, but the route was still active. Teams moved at their own pace, spread out across the mountain, but everyone was exposed to the same terrain above them. By morning, the team reached the beginning of the traverse beneath the Serac. The crossing stretched for several hundred feet across the steep slope, with fixed ropes running directly beneath the ice formation overhead. The ice felt firm, the anchors looked secure, and at that moment, there was nothing that suggested the route was in immediate danger. I'd imagine, standing there, the route probably looked exactly like what climbers expect to see, a difficult section of Everest, but one that felt manageable. The final moments before the crossing were later described by Lakpa and the surviving support Sherpa who was approaching from behind. Their accounts, combined with route photographs and the positions of recovered equipment, helped investigators reconstruct where each climber was located when the collapse occurred. Before entering the traverse, Lakpa made a final assessment of the route conditions. In later statements, he explained that there was no visible sign of an immediate collapse at that moment. The mountain was quiet. There was no audible cracking, no falling debris, and no visible sign of imminent failure. In a later account, he explained that he had already presented his concerns, recommended an alternate route multiple times, and documented the decision to continue on the standard line. With no clear indication of immediate collapse and insufficient evidence to justify closing the route, his only remaining option was to move the team through the exposed section as efficiently as possible. I think about Lapka standing there in that silence, having said everything he was able to say, and now just trying to get his people across fast. The traverse began. The positions of the climbers, combined with survivor accounts and the later investigation, showed that the four family members were directly within the main path of the collapse, while Lakpa and the rear Sherpa were struck closer to the edge of the debris field. Their technique was solid, practiced over weeks of acclimatization and earlier rotations. By the time they were more than halfway across the traverse, the lead support Sherpa was nearing the far side of the exposed section. Adrian and the rest of the family followed at regular intervals behind him. Lakpa was well into the crossing, while the rear support Sherpa had not yet fully entered the traverse. The first warning came as a sound. A deep crack echoed from above, followed almost immediately by a heavy, low groan that seemed to move through the mountain itself. Climbers farther away would later describe feeling it before they even fully understood what they were hearing. The sound came only moments before anything visibly changed in the Serac above. Lakpa later reported recognizing the sound as a possible sign of instability. My brain keeps catching on that groan, the kind you feel in your chest before your mind has even caught up to what's happening. The lower section of the Sirac broke away along the existing fracture line and began to fragment as it fell. The collapse triggered additional snow and ice release from the face above the traverse, adding to the volume already in motion. The resulting debris flow accelerated rapidly downslope, reaching the traverse only seconds after the first fracture was heard. The climbers had almost no chance to get out of the way. The steep slope, the fixed ropes, and how quickly the ice came down left them with very few options. I can almost picture how helpless that moment must have felt, with the route right in front of them and the danger coming from above. Later analysis suggested that the debris moved across the traverse at an extremely high speed and spread wide enough to cover the entire exposed section of the route. A crossing that had looked stable just moments before was suddenly right in the path of the collapse. The collapse reached the traverse within seconds. The first wave of debris hit the exposed section of the route, leaving the climbers with no real time to react. Adrian, Adela, Adiel, and Daniela were caught in the main flow of debris, while Lakpa, who was closer to the edge of the traverse, was struck by a smaller part of the collapse. The rear support Sherpa, still making his way toward the crossing, was knocked down by the force of the impact, but avoided being pulled into the main debris field. The avalanche of ice and snow continued down the Lhotse face, carrying debris far below the traverse. Subsequent investigations concluded that the forces involved were unsurvivable, citing the combination of high-velocity impact, crushing debris, and the long descent down the steep face. When the movement finally stopped, the landscape had been transformed. The traverse had been erased. Large sections of the route were buried beneath fresh debris, and the fixed ropes that had marked the crossing were no longer visible. Lakpa was located and freed from the debris by the rear support Sherpa after an initial search of the area. Both men descended to Camp 2, where emergency contact was established with Base Camp. Lakpa was later evacuated to a hospital in Kathmandu for treatment of fractured ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and frostbite. Within days, he provided recorded statements to government investigators and the guiding company's review team. His pre-incident documentation helped investigators reconstruct the discussions and decisions made before the accident. Search and rescue teams from neighboring expeditions reached the debris field later that day. The volume of ice and the instability of the terrain made excavation extremely dangerous, limiting initial efforts to surface searches. Additional rescue personnel arrived the following morning. Over the next several days, teams recovered fragments of climbing equipment associated with the expedition, but no intact remains were found. The debris field was ultimately judged too deep and unstable for further excavation, and the official search was suspended. The subsequent incident review concluded that the deaths resulted from the Serac collapse and the force of the debris impact on the Lhotse face. Investigators found that concerns regarding the formation had been discussed before the accident and that multiple route options had been considered by the team. The collapse was classified as an objective mountain hazard rather than the result of equipment failure or a clear violation of expedition procedures. If you liked today's video, go ahead and smash that like button, and what the heck, go ahead and subscribe. You know you want to. We'll see you next time.